Szanowni Państwo, mam
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you at the conference about the role of museums and memorial sites in the changing world. This is the 75th anniversary of the foundation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. I would like to welcome the representatives of the President of the Republic of Poland, state and local authorities, the representatives of the diplomatic corps and the members of the Museum Council. I would like to welcome the representative of state institutions, associations and foundations, museums and memorial sites from Poland and abroad. Let me welcome everybody present at today's conference, and let me stress once again, it is a great honor and great pleasure for us to have you with us on this special day. Our conference is held under the honorary patronage of the President of the Republic of Poland, Andrzej Duda.
Wszyscy Państwo korzystają z tłumaczenia.
Is everybody using the translation set, the set for simultaneous translation? I would like to ask our assistants to bring the headsets for our guests in the front row.
Spotykamy się dziś, Szanowni Państwo,
Today we meet to discuss and debate about the important issues for our museums. That is why good understanding is of key importance. Let me wait a few moments for you to prepare the headsets for translation. And if you permit, I would like to welcome once again everybody. We would like all of you to feel that it is so significant that you are sharing this particular moment with us, that we can meet on this very important anniversary and occasion. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to extend the words of warm welcome to everybody participating in the conference, the role of museums and memorial sites in the changing world, the 75th anniversary of the foundation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum and Memorial. I would like to welcome the representatives of the President of the Republic of Poland, state and local authorities, the representatives of the diplomatic corps and the members of the Foundation of Museum, the representatives of the associations, memorial sites and musea in Poland and abroad. I would like to welcome everybody who is present here and who participates in the conference. Our conference is held under the honorary patronage of the President of the Republic of Poland, Mr. Andrzej Duda, and the organizer is the State Museum Auschwitz-Birkenau with the Association for the Management of Memorial Sites. We are guided by a quote of one of the survivors and many years director of the museum, Kazimierz Smoleń, who said, "We did not know whether we will survive, but we spoke about a memorial site." That is about creating some institution or monument. We were only convinced that humankind cannot forget about the crimes committed at Auschwitz. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like all of us to feel the gravity of these words. So let us listen to them again. We did not know if we would survive, but we spoke about a memorial site. That is about creating some kind of institution, monument. We were only convinced that humankind cannot forget about the crimes committed at Auschwitz. Let us imagine those people who found themselves at the very bottom of the hell, of the inferno, where death is much more certain than anything else. They had absolutely no reason to believe that they were facing any kind of future. But still, something unimaginable happened. The prisoners thought about their future. If they didn't think about their own future, about their personal experiences in the future, what kind of future did they think of? First of all, they thought about the future of the place. They saw the death factory, concentration camp, extermination camp. They saw the Annus Mundi, but also they saw some kind of institution here, a memorial site. It is very difficult to imagine how much strength and wisdom it takes to see through the smoke coming out of the crematorium and to hear through the crying of the children at selection places, through the heaps of dead bodies, to see the memorial site here and now. They thought about future posterities. They had no doubt that humankind must not forget about atrocities and crimes committed here. And finally, they thought about each and every one of us, about each of us gathered here, about each of the guards and protectors of the memorial sites. They did not know our names. They did not know our faces. But still, already then, when the camp was still in operation, they profoundly believed that such people would be there. They didn't know us, but still they entrusted us with the obligation to take care of the site, of the memory, and of the education. Therefore, today, on the 25th anniversary of the foundation of the State Museum and Memorial Site at Auschwitz-Birkenau, we would like to follow the path that was set by the survivors. We will keep remembering. We will never forget about the past, but we would like to concentrate on the challenges of the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to ask the social advisor of the president of the prime minister to read the letter that was sent for this occasion.
Dzień dobry Państwu.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to be the special envoy of the President of the Republic of Poland. He wanted to join us in person, but the international situation, as you very well know, made him be obliged to be present somewhere else. The organizers and participants of the 75th anniversary of the foundation of Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to extend my words of welcome to the participants of the conference on the 75th anniversary of the foundation of the museum and memorial site. I would like to welcome the guests, the representatives of Polish and foreign institutions commemorating the victims of the Holocaust. Also, I would like to extend the words of welcome to the hosts of the celebration, who on everyday basis look after the site of the most tragic atrocities committed by the Third Reich. On behalf of the Polish Republic, I would like to thank you for your endeavors to commemorate the place of the extermination. First of all, about the Jews, but also we should remember about other victims and prisoners who were murdered, Polish people, Roma people, Sinti and Soviet prisoners. What happened here 80 years ago goes beyond human comprehension. The territories of the occupied Poland, which was the land of Pauline, where the Jews lived for many years enjoying liberties, developing their own culture, social and religious life. It is there that the Nazi Germany brought the industrial methods of human extermination. They closed our brothers in ghettos, they built camps, organizing mass transportations and planned murder of millions of the Jews from the entire world. The violence and brutality of the perpetrators who changed the crimes into the source of income fills us with awe and frightens us. It is quite difficult to understand how individuals, an entire nation, were capable of such dehumanization and demoralization. But still, we must not forget about what happened here in Auschwitz-Birkenau and in other camps, and we must never forget it. It is our obligation and duty to guard the memory about the millions of helpless victims. Therefore, Polish state takes every effort to commemorate what has been saved from the Nazi concentration camp in Auschwitz. This mission is fulfilled by this museum, which for 75 years has been looking after this place, guarding the evidence of the genocide, documents and disseminates knowledge about the Holocaust of the Jews and extermination of other nations by the Germans. It is an important task, a task that is important for the entire humanity, because Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum must be a warning what racism, hatred and despise will lead to. And from this place, we should hear a warning, never again. Andrzej Duda, the President of the Republic of Poland. Thank you very much.
Szanowni Państwo,
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we have a special letter to the organizers and participants of the event that brings us together today. Has been sent by the President of the Council of Ministers, Mr. Morawiecki, and I'll have the honor to read it out. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it has been 75 years since the Polish Parliament passed the establishment of the State Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. According to the document, the premises of the former Nazi concentration camp, together with all the preserved facilities, were to be preserved forever and ever as a monument memorial of all the victims murdered here. The victims of a place whose presence, even though that brutally realistic, exceeds the borders of our imagination. The places where more than a million human beings were dealt death to, and further thousands were tormented with destructive labor in the horrendous conditions of everyday life in the camp. The place that, in its capacity of the largest Nazi death camp, became the symbol of mass crime, not to be understood in its intention and implementation. As Kazimierz Smoleń, former inmate and then long-term director of the museum, mentioned, while still in the camp, never knowing whether they would ever manage to leave it, the inmates were convinced that this should be and has to be turned into a memorial, that humanity cannot forget the crimes perpetrated in Auschwitz. It is thanks to their effort that this museum was developed, a museum that not only makes sure that the material, witnesses and testimonies and documentation of the genocide perpetrated here is retained in good condition, but also, together with the witnesses, it stands guard at the truth about that genocide. However, the contemporary time closes certain chapters, at the same time brings new challenges, changing the face of the world we live in. Witnesses pass away, even those who have untiringly worked for our memory to be tantamount to true. What is left are their testimonies. After the Second World War, it was believed that mankind received such a horrendous and horrible lesson that the nightmare of the war, bearing the wave of a crime, cannot repeat now, and it is not the first time that we unfortunately learn that this is possible. An ever greater impact on the reality we live in lies among the contemporary technologies. This is also true about promoting know-how and education. New forms of running discourse and new platforms of discourse also influence the shape of discourse and therefore also of collective memory. Everything changes. That is why I believe that the fact that the 75th anniversary of establishment, the State Museum and Memorial Auschwitz-Birkenau, its management decided to honor the place with a debate on the role of museum and places of remembrance, memorial sites in the changing world, I believe highly commendable, especially that this is a way of active influence of shaping people's attitudes. Thanking you for a profound understanding of the mission that you have, I'd like to express the hope that despite the passing time, we will manage to save the memory of truth. This is a memory that we owe the victims. This is the memory that we also owe to the future generations. Yours respectfully, Mateusz Morawiecki.
Szanowni Państwo, a teraz o...
And now, ladies and gentlemen, may I now ask for the keynote lecture. May I ask to hear Dr. Piotr Cywiński in his capacity of the director of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Szanowni Państwo,
times are changing.
czasy się zmieniają coraz szybciej.
Are manifested in more than just new emerging technologies or global warming. Virtually every anthropological plan is now evolving at an increasingly rapid pace. The Russian war in Ukraine reflects this in the most profound way. Our institutions, memorial sites and museums, which have in their hand a message of unique importance for all humanity, today must undergo a deep, fundamental reflection on our joint work with remembrance, education, and formation, our dialogue with the world, and on the clarity of the message we convey. We could have chosen a different way to honor the last 75 years of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum. We could have organized a solemn concert or a cultural event. However, in view of the current situation, it seems to me that this 75th anniversary is the best moment to embark upon such a broad and shared reflection. I propose to begin with 7 personal observations, hoping to spur a lively debate among our excellent panelists, as well as all of those among us who have assumed responsibility for the future of the remembrance of the Shoah and of the crimes committed by the Third Reich. Generations. Our memorial sites and museums now find themselves at the most important turning point in their history. Survivors who have so far carried the world that has shaped our remembrance are now all but gone. Future anniversaries, commemorations, and events will need to rely on other means of expression. We are faced with a great temptation to replace survivors' voices with silence, art, speeches delivered by politicians, or words of the new generations. But that is not why survivors wrote hundreds of books, provided thousands of accounts, and recorded personal interviews. Their words remain in our hands, and we must do everything we can today to ensure that they, even though many of them may be physically absent, remain at the very heart of our narrative. I think one fundamental reason for this is the only way we can avoid exaggerated historical interpretations, ward off the threats of politicization, and prevent any divergence from the discourse on remembrance. For some time now, students have hailed from generations whose grandparents were born after the war. Most teenagers no longer have any personal familial links to any living witnesses to these events. To a much greater degree, their education relies on schools as well as on collective media outlets. At the same time, they are much more vulnerable to the fragmentary and biased information found in their meandering online. This is all the more reason for us to ensure that a visit to our institutions become an emotional and intellectual experience which will remain long remembered, an event that will become a point of reference and a refuge of truth that will influence the formation of their own thought and experiences. Today's adults know more about history and have a better understanding of its importance because they themselves, as teenagers, visited our memorial site in the 90s or later. This also applies to today's teachers. When they arrive at our memorial sites with their students, it is usually not their first visit, but a return to the place that had once given and shown them something important. But this indicates how essential it is to assist educators in preparing their class or groups for those visits. To a large extent, generational changes redefine the tactical priorities of our remembrance institutions. We need a reasonable international conversation in order to be prepared for this redefinition together. Social dialogue. The COVID-19 pandemic has clearly demonstrated that the sphere of influence of memorial sites cannot be confined to their physical boundaries. We have still not shared enough our experience from that difficult period, and we have not fully explored potential ideas for our future remote-based operations. We live in a time when the axis of dialogue and the vectors of political discourse are undergoing significant changes that are difficult to define. In the past, sources of knowledge for adolescents were their families, schools, books. Today, the sources have increasingly become online platforms, social networking sites, discussion groups, like-minded online communities, recirculated memes, viral messages, and disinformation, slander and hate campaigns. This forced us to devise and coordinate entirely new, customized pathway to reach our audiences, as well as new methods for narrating the past, passing on and strengthening historical truth, and highlighting its consequences for today's world in an even more compelling way. I am certain that our experience derived from the past decades is a good way to prepare for this effort. Since their creation, memorial sites have not been structurally linked to the school education system, and to a limited degree were part of the difficult narrative shared within families, and books were not our main tools. Peace and war. In the last decades, many people felt surprised when Jewish communities throughout the world, marked by the experience of the Shoah, associated almost every act of anti-Semitism with the atrocious times of genocide. But today, as we all observe Russia's attack on Ukraine, politicians, journalists, educators, and various other participants in the public debate themselves draw analogies to World War II. It seems to me that never before has a pedagogical understanding of the role of the past been as crucial as it is now. This is partially due to the disgusting propaganda originating in Moscow, which accused Ukraine of Nazism and fashions itself as a liberating power. But it can only partially be explained by the Kremlin rhetoric. The fact that more than 40 countries have spoken out in support of Ukraine, complete with the great outpouring of human solidarity with Ukrainian refugees, suggests that the perspective of a passive spectator is largely being abandoned. The dissemination of our view of history is certainly no small contribution to the understanding of the present and a serious warning for the future. But it is also indicative of the public's increasing understanding that answers to today's most difficult questions can be found in the patterns of the past. This evolution may only be a short weather window triggered by the war, but it validated the relevance of our education and posed new, further-reaching questions. One of them is about preserving a specific vision of history in the public discourse, on which becomes a permanent point of reference rather than mere sequences of dates and facts. Symbolism. The debate about the values and traits related to the symbolic understanding of our memorial sites, which began 25 years ago, maybe longer, has yet not to be resolved. The debate has focused on the limits of possible comparisons of cases of genocide. However, symbolism does not only manifest itself in the sphere of comparisons. The never again appeal in itself embodies the need to link today's tragedies with the message of the past. This clearly applies to any case of anti-Semitic, racist, and dehumanizing aggression. We cannot fail to draw on the experience of the past in the face of mounting populism, manipulation, and propaganda. We need to revisit that discussion without being overcome by fear and what will anyway always remains beyond comparison. We need to do that in order to better and more wisely identify and expose those elements of the political discourse which have been resorting to the same, or at least very similar, tactical or rhetorical ploys that we remember all too well from the past. The never again promise cannot only refer to the content of the message being conveyed. It must also be a warning against its present forms and tactical tricks. The Polyphony of Remembrance. Remembrance, to which we have dedicated years of work, is not a monologue. This is clear to any guide and any wise teacher and educator. While the discourse of the authorities in a conflict situation always take on the shape of propaganda, remembrance, especially in a post-conflict context, is always polyphonic. The notes of the polyphony depend on family narratives, local traumas preserved in people's memories, and on one's own sensitivity. Textbooks will never account for that. But it is the truth, after all. If you want to be inclusive and credible, while remaining within the frame of unconditional historical truth, we must embrace that polyphonic side of remembrance with greater wisdom. It is also with greater wisdom that we should integrate the accounts handed down within families and encourage discourse with local narratives. We should stimulate the young generations to reflect on what has already been instilled in them of their history in order to better show its meaning, its background, and its consequences. Education and the rite of passage. Referring to my earlier comment, memorial sites were not created by education system. They were created in diverse ways in particular countries, and their origin can usually be tracked back to the survivors and the non-governmental organizations created by and around them. We have always been ahead of our times. Decades passed before schools began to align their curricula with that students' experience while visiting the memorial sites. Our narrative has always been threatened by various fashionable changes, novelties and gadgets. Some have been captivated by audio guides, others by interactive features, or still other by multimedia. This is not what should attract the next generations of students to our memorial sites, the strength of which was, is, and always will be in their authenticity. Today, as I see it, one does not visit Auschwitz, one passes through it. It is not about observing it from the outside. It is about placing oneself on the core of the great question that is a legacy of Auschwitz. For everyone, it's a kind of rite of passage. We want to, and we must do everything in our power to ensure that the young people who pass through our memorial site emerge transformed, and that we, at least, plant the seeds of future change deep inside them. It is this function of the rite of passage that must remain at the very center of our attention. Both yesterday and today, young people must pass through our sites and museums and emerge transformed, able to ask themselves more conscious questions about their own choices in today's world. Only then will it become possible for our message not to be reduced to a mere history lesson in school curricula. Only then will our message be present in the future, right where it should be, in education about society, politics, media, religion, and ethics. And the last one, moral anxiety. Perhaps we have placed too much hope in simple emotions. We have seen young people cry. We have seen them stand in silence and reflection. We have seen them at a loss for words. Too many times we were easily convinced that it worked. We chose Anne Frank's diary as recommended reading for class after class of young teenagers because we expect that through identification and empathy we will win education. Meanwhile, those groups of rebellious teens who, as is typical for their age, saw the world in very contrasting colors, were being encouraged to identify with a person who was doomed to die, whom her own parents could not protect, and who was treated by evil, an evil which was not only external, even worse, faceless. Today, we must think deeply about what we want to achieve through our activities. It is not only about historical facts or only about empathic emotions. If you want to read of passage to work fully, if you want people to emerge from the memorial sites better prepared to act, we need to stir moral anxiety in their hearts. Anxiety about their deeds, words, and the choices they make as human beings. This commitment must more fully become a consequence of visiting our memorial sites. We cannot do it alone or in isolation. We need to act together in a planned and concerted way. The moral shape of the world does not depend on schools, media, or politicians. Still, it is what we all see as a priority and to what we have dedicated decades of our lives. Thank you.
Szanowni Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen, this lecture was an introduction for our discussion panel in which the eminent panelists are going to participate. But we also planned this panel to include a discussion with you, with everybody present here, and I do hope that we will devote enough time for this, because as the director said, we want to think about it together and we want to act together. The participants of the discussion panel are the following, and please join us on stage. So, Sara Broomfield, the director of the United States Holocaust Memorial in Washington, please take the floor. Join us on stage. Deborah Hartman, the director of the Memorial Site Conference House in Wannsee.
Tal
Bruttmann, a historian, a member of the Committee of Memorial and director of Memorial de la Shoah. Piotr Cywiński and Dani, Dayan, the head of the Directorate of Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Memorial Site. Ladies and gentlemen, I will be asking about the issues which resulted from the inauguration lecture or are the echoes or extensions of the speech or were inspired by it. And I would like to begin with the issue that is very important for us, that has been important for us for a long time. We know that the moment when the last of the survivors of Auschwitz will pass away, this moment is imminent. We should answer a question: what kind of threats, temptations, and challenges are brought by it? What does this dramatic, let me say once again, dramatic change will bring? Because the voice of those who survived will always be dramatic and most important. What does the generation change signify for memory, for our sites? And I would like to begin with Director Sara Broomfield.
Do I just speak? Is it on? Oh, great, great. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's an honor to be here, and congratulations to all my friends and colleagues who do such a wonderful job leading this memorial site and bringing us to this day. You know, I'm often asked, you know, well, what replaces the survivors? Of course, nothing replaces survivors. They are not replaceable. So to me, we have to rethink the question. And I think one question is how to best use them, what we have them, is a challenge. And then the other is to try to understand what is it that they uniquely do. And of course, they're not replaceable, but it's the power of those stories that are so important. And we know from talking to our visitors and to teachers that they want more personal stories. They ask for this, and they want them illustrated through items from our collection. So there's a big demand for educational resources based on, for example, diaries, which means you can have the victims speaking, right? Not just the survivors, but now the victims are speaking to you through those stories in many cases where they did not survive, but the diary did. I want to say something about holograms, which I know is something that's been experimented with, and I think that's a very interesting experimentation. I think we need to do more research and think about how that technology will be seen in the future. I'm sure we're all concerned about deep fakes. If you haven't been concerned about deep fakes, we should be in our field where people can recreate survivor testimony that looks authentic, but of course has been manipulated with. So that seems to me a very big challenge for our field. How will we respond to that? The last thing I would just say is about the storytelling about individuals is that through something we call in America called the Digital Humanities, where scholars can now look at individual names and also through artificial intelligence images, faces, and they will be able to connect dots of individuals where there might be a record over here, something else in an archive over there. They could be scattered all around the world, but they will be able to connect those dots and tell personal stories in a way we've never been able to do before. This is just starting to happen. I think it's going to really flourish after our lifetimes, but it will be a new way to bring personal stories to life in ways we haven't. Of course, no substitute for the survivors, but new opportunities to tell those stories.
Bardzo dziękuję za ten głos. Rzeczywiście siła tych historii jest...
Thank you very much for this contribution. I believe that this power of the stories affects us significantly, and this is one of the fundamental issues. We all think how to grasp the proper balance between the unique experience of physical contact with another person, with an object, with the place, with the site, because we know that this matters a lot. We don't want even the best technology to replace people. We don't want technology to stop people coming to Auschwitz, to Washington, to Wannsee, to Yad Vashem. We don't want technology to replace this experience. Whereas, on the other hand, we know that we must not neglect these technologies. As Sara Bloomfield said, these technologies offer us a unique chance. And my question to Dani, Dayan, how to grasp the balance between the authenticity and the power of personal physical contact. And on the other hand, with all those great perspectives which are brought by new technologies.
Thank you so much for the question, but I don't think that we are talking about an alternative to survivors. Technology is extremely important, but I completely agree with Sara that to put one as a replacement of the other, as a substitute to the other, is a gross mistake. We can use technology now. We don't, and even in the era in which we have survivors and we use technology and technology serves us, and it is very important. And it's technology can be a powerful way to convey the message, but it can also be, in sometimes, a damaging way to convey the message. The technology is a tool; it's not an aim by itself. In that sense, also, it is contrary to the survivor, which is the survivor is the message. Technology is not the message. And we have also to be very careful in the usage of technology, not only in what Sara referred as deepfake, but also in putting words in the mouth of survivors by means of technology. That's the reason we are in Yad Vashem quite skeptical about the use of holograms. If holograms or artificial intelligence are a way, if holograms are a way to display what the survivor said in the context in which he said, and we can be 100% sure that we are not distorting the context in which he said that or she said that, that's one thing. But if we put in the mouth of a survivor that is not, that passed away, words that probably he said, but in answer to a different question to that is being presented to him or to her, that is in our best judgment, extremely difficult. And I want to say, look, the technology, you know, is a buzzword that we love to use. I want to be now a little bit antiquated. When survivors will be not with us, not necessarily technology will be the answer to that. I want to propose, for instance, that increasing our efforts of gathering documentation is no less important than a novel technique that leaves our jaws dropping. When survivors will be no longer amongst us, indeed that will be the happy hour of the denialists and the distortionists. But I'm not sure that technology will the way in which we will prevail in the arguments with the denialists. Probably the contrary. And probably they will use technology that are probably better than our technology. The way to prevail when survivors will not be amongst us in our battle with the deniers and the distortionists is to be in a solid factual ground of documentation and in a solid research ground that converts that documentation, that data, into accurate research, research that converts into accurate knowledge. Maybe I am old-fashioned, and we in Yad Vashem we do invest and will invest even more in technology, but I do not see technology as the panacea, as the recipe to counter or fallacies or to convey the ultimate method to convey the message.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Director. the issues, even purely technical ones, are very important. Let me just say, like a footnote for our discussion, 3 short examples of what the director was saying and what Director Bloomfield was saying. So first of all, the tests with holograms have a problem that artificial intelligence is improving. The algorithms are better constructed and the hologram is able to respond to questions. But at some point, in a human being who uses a hologram, there is a moment that a person is more interested not in the power of the story, but in the testing of technology. So they keep asking strange questions to see how a hologram will behave. So this is an important question, whether the fascination with technology and an attempt to test it, whether it does not obscure the power of the story. Another thing, just to enliven our debate, our discussion from a different point of view, from a different field, because it is not only us that are facing these questions. The future of education is, in general, because there is a lot of research in many countries that an introduction of modern technologies into teaching mathematics brings devastating results for the competencies of the students. But perhaps it is quite opposite. Who puts more money into teaching of mathematics with the use of more technologies will gain poorer results, which does not mean that education is meant to give up modern technologies. But not everything is so simple. And the third thing concerning holograms, interesting research that resonated worldwide. This was the research carried out by a Polish scholar, Professor Galińska, at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This was a very important research. It was a talk with an artificial intelligence, the same algorithm that is artificial intelligence worked the same in both cases, but in one case it had a form of a speaking person, a living person. In the second one, it was just a voice coming of a computer. Let me stress it. It was the same algorithm which simply gave the answers to the question, and a dramatic difference in the questionnaires of the users. If they look at the speaking person, that was the artificial intelligence, they had a very low esteem of their skills, believing that this person was stupid and does not satisfy their needs and that this person could not cope. Whereas they had a much higher esteem of voice rendered only, without the human person behind it. And this research affects the construction of robots, because big companies gave up the creation of humanoid robots, which some time ago seemed to be the core of the technology development. Large companies keep giving it up because the users did not react enthusiastically about it. 3 short examples just to show the difficulty of the moment in which we are. The same question, because it is an important issue. The same question should be asked to Director Hartmann. Authenticity, traditional methods, and artificial intelligence.
I feel also very honored and excited being here. Maybe before I will answer your question, at the beginning of this event, we spoke very often about the being guardians of the memorial sites, and I don't know why, but I'm sometimes very, confused using this kind of terminology, and I'm not so sure if this is the right terminology, understanding ourselves as guards or guidance of the memory of the memorial sites, because in some way this emphasizes some kind of disconnection separation between us and actually the rest of the world. And I think we should put more efforts to reflect our own position and perspective as museums and memorial sites that, of course, continuously transformed over the last 7 decades. So I think we should have a deeper look into the history of each place of those memorials, why and how and who established those places. And I think it's very important to remember that mostly personal and public initiatives, survivors, and the civic society, that were the people that brought us into being. And I think this, we should carefully protect this legacy in order to remain independent, even though many of us are state-funded today. And this brings us back to, I think, the first remarks we heard today, the quote, we didn't know if we survive, but we spoke about memorial sites. So if we speak about technology, then I think it's very important to remember that it's not only technology that puts words into the survivors. So it's not only the technology that overshadows the voice of the survivor. So of course there is a temptation, or you spoke about the danger of the use of technology. Of course there is an increasing tendency of instrumentalization of survivors and their legacy. And yeah, we all know that in a few years there won't be survivors amongst us, so there is no one who actually can fight back against this kind of trivialization or banalization. And on the other side, we need to focus on new formats. We need to face the generational change, and I think it's also important to create new possibilities to access the past from the present and to have some kind of connection between the history and us. And if we look at, I looked at it yesterday evening, of course we have new studies that show a decrease of historical knowledge among the younger generation when it comes to the Holocaust. However, in Germany, for example, there are recent studies also found out that young adults from the Generation Z show increasing interest in the period of National Socialism. So the Holocaust is a very relevant topic for them. They relate to it, to experiences of exclusion, of discrimination, of humiliation. But of course, they are looking for new, shorter formats to consume the information about the past. And this is a problem. I think we can use those kind of technologies. And Dani, Dayan, you spoke about it, that Yad Vashem was very much hesitating to get in touch with those new formats. And I remember it also quite well when I was working in Yad Vashem, that I think when Eva Stories was published on Instagram, we didn't speak about it. We didn't want to deal with it because we were also very much, I think, afraid of losing control over the message we would like to spread. But looking at it from today, I think that was a mistake, because I think we can be critical, but we also can have a very active part in it. We can define for what purpose to use these media and platforms. And maybe it's not so much about a deep learning about the historical event itself. Maybe actually we can use those platforms to reflect about collective memory, to ask questions, okay, why do we remember and how? And I think those are the questions that are maybe more relevant when using those technologies.
May I say a word about Eva's story?
Yeah.
This is a very interesting point, because when I arrived to Yad Vashem, and I wasn't at Yad Vashem when Eva's Stories was launched, I thought also that it was a mistake not to cooperate with it, at even, being the producers of that. But there are, today I see it a little bit differently. There has to be a very clear distinction between fact and fiction. It's imperative that we have a very clear differentiation, what is fact and what is fiction. And there is another thing, the millions of viewers of Eva's Stories don't understand that the first thing that the Nazis did to Eva was to take her iPhone, basically to isolate her from the world. And in that sense, it conveyed to the millions of viewers a wrong message, like Eva had opportunities to do things that she, and even to save herself, that she didn't have. So the distinction here it's a delicate issue that has to be handled with very carefully.
Very interesting discussion. When we touch the topic, we start to see the details, and as we know, and as we say in Poland, the devil is in details. Ale chciałbym, żebyśmy też... I started to speak English. Chciałbym, żebyśmy zaczęli też, żebyśmy...
I'd like also to follow that trail discussed by Dr. Hartmann, and to follow it into much broader seas. We must remember that technologies are none but a tool. They are no magician's wand that will make everyone interested in the theme and subject. Technologies bring extreme opportunities, but they also entail certain threats and also temptations. The most important thing, however, is what our mission is, what we want to share. We've already managed to draw certain elements of our world. We have those instantaneous, flash-like changes in our world that change people, that change generations. For example, by deepening the generational gap. A powerful social challenge, that is. We have that world of divides in the societies, emotions heated to the maximum, fake news, then crude manipulations, and all around the world a growth of populist tendencies. We still haven't overcome the hydra of anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of intolerance. Now, with all that panorama of the world before your eyes, Professor, what is our mission?
Wow. I don't know if it's a mission, it's a task, and we have to deal with it, but we have to face a lot of challenges, and the first one which was discussed is the question of the survivors. And the other one was the question of deniers, but there will be no rise of deniers. They're always been there, even with survivors being present. So the idea that with no more survivors, we'll have denial and denial, it's not exactly right, because deniers have always been there since the end of the war, basically. So it's not going to change anything except the fact that the more powerful voices, the witnesses, the survivors, won't be there anymore. And it was already pointed out that we can't replace them. So thinking that new technology will change anything, I'm not very religious, but beware of the false gods. It's not going to change anything, except the idea that, hey, let's take an hologram and it's going to say history. If we take out the moral question about the Holocaust and Nazi violence, and we think about history, as let's call it a science to make it short, we have always done history without survivors. I mean, since Greece, Rome, Judea, we don't have any survivors from 2,000 years ago, and we are still doing the history of ancient Greece or Rome. So it's not a challenge by itself. The challenge is how we keep people being interested in events that created the world we are living on. I mean, Europe, for instance, and we see, and the director Cywiński spoke about it, and we'll speak about it later, we are in a period now with a war going on in Eastern Europe, linked to the Second World War, not because we decided it, but because Russia has decided it. So we see that this very special event, the Second World War, and in it, the Holocaust, the Shoah, is still present, not because we want it in Auschwitz, in Yad Vashem, in Washington, or Wannsee, or because I'm an Holocaust historian, but because it's there and it's going to stay there a long time. So not only we must be careful with new technology, but I can also cite other examples. For instance, in France, we have people claiming to be witness to survivors. Grandson, granddaughters saying, I'm going to carry the testimony of my mother, my grandfather, or whatever. It's absurd. The only ones that can be witnesses are the survivors. And then it's over, and we have videos, books, accounts, etc., etc. And it's going to be the usual work of historians, institutions, memorials, guides, and so on. And on the one hand, it's a very special history, not because any religious question, but it's a very special history for political reasons, which are obvious even more nowadays. On the other hand, we have also to keep in mind its history. And we have to deal with history as we deal with any other period, any other topic in history. And we have to weight both of them.
Bardzo dziękuję i znowu wypowiedź profesora Bruttmana.
Thank you very much. Again, Professor Bruttmann's contribution opens multiple paths for reflection that we could follow. But let me choose one, combining it to what Director Hartmann put up. It's certainly so that one of the tasks we have been given from the survivors is the protection of those places and of those messages from this primitive politicization that goes beyond any doubt, from using the power of that history for the current political, if not party interests. And that goes without saying for us. During the sessions of the International Auschwitz Council, Sara Bloomfield and Piotr Cywiński will confirm that the survivors often emphasize that. We often discussed different exhibitions, and we were asking to what degree we should make them refer to the current events. Usually the answer was there should be no references. Let's leave it to the visitors. Let them translate those stories into the experience of their lives and their own conclusions. On the other hand, however, I must be honest with you, and we're family, so I'm going to be very honest. The war against Ukraine complicated that thinking, that line of thinking within me, because I meet so many people who want to speak of Auschwitz in the context of what is being dealt to Ukraine. Now, toute proportions gardées, we must not mix the orders, but the tendency is that in Europe, for the first time, we felt that cold breath of war on our necks. So we're looking for a point of reference. Let me share a very personal reflection and experience. I used to go to the refugees by night to the Warsaw Central Station. And once I was crossing that station and I saw little Ukrainian children sleeping just on the concrete flagstones of that station. That was stronger than me, that I suddenly saw with my eyes. I recalled the photographs from the album from the Warsaw Ghetto. Obviously, there is a difference. It doesn't make sense to compare suffering to suffering. But there are those tired children who were forced to leave their homes. They are tired, sleeping. Luckily, there is no destruction waiting for them, no death. They will be extended care around. They'll take a train, they'll go somewhere to somebody's home. But I'm just sharing my experience. My monolith attitude, never make any references, has been weakened. And I find it hard to cope. And if I can't cope with things that concern Auschwitz, I ask Piotr Cywiński.
Ponieważ to jest bardzo ważne pytanie, po polsku.
This is a very important question. Please let me answer it in Polish. Yes, because we're talking about a number of various levels, platforms on which we deal with this history. There's certainly the historical plane, brutally factographic, unchallengeable.
Albo coś się stało, albo coś się nie stało.
Something did happen or it did not.
Tu nie ma
There is no
albo jest płaszczyzna pamięci,
option for any other discussion, or there is one
przestrzenią polifoniczną.
of memory, remembrance. I told you already, it's polyphonic, and it is very strongly conditioned subjectively, as it depends on the person of the rememberer. That person has absolutely different points of reference. That's what happens to the visitors. We don't know the points of reference of the visitors to Auschwitz. So we tell them about history, but we share certain forms of remembrance, never knowing ahead what the messages are going to hit, what the background those people have. And this creates this multi-plane, multi-level message. Therefore, to me, the key question here when it comes to the history and to remembrance is what the final target of that message is supposed to be, where it should take root in our anthropological reality. For if this is no more but history, then perhaps, other than those obvious mad people, that's a binary thing. Yes, no, it happened like this, never differently. But this is going to move further and further away. From a generation to generation, that is going to disappear gradually. If then this makes it to this living memory, this living memory is something that I understand, and that's important, not as remembering facts, but as a key for today, a key that today it opens doors, even though this is a key that comes from the past, but that remembrance is used today, then this polyphony may cause far-going drifting away. I am convinced that to make history a living history, the history that speaks, and that remembrance is the key to today's decisions, it's of fundamental importance for the coming years that the history of the camps, of the places of death, destruction, is not only taken to the books of history, but through this good understanding that this is the key to various questions asked today, that it may become an important part of our post-war identity. Because identity is something that takes much longer to evolve. 1, 2, 3 events are not enough to change the identity entirely. In the 1980s and 90s, a success was reached that the history of the Shoah was entered into the history book. At the time, the threat of negationism was the greatest threat. It was taught at different universities throughout Europe. And that is a huge step forward. I believe that today we must enter, just like we entered those facts into history, we must explain that they are already there in the identity of the post-war world, which was developing on so many planes in reference to that experience, cultural, political, There is actually no anthropological plane that would not have been painfully affected by that experience. I believe that the key here is identity. Sara Bloomfield, please.
So I just want to add another just way to think about this. I'm not sure what exactly what you're talking about, but it'll change the conversation a little bit maybe. And I think there's a distinction between a specific event, this case the Holocaust, and recurring human phenomenon like genocide, which happened before and after the Holocaust, or massive refugee flows from human rights violations, which happened before and after the Holocaust, crimes against humanity, as we see. Those are phenomenon, right? And the Holocaust is a very specific event that has its own particular history and things to teach, but it also has some of these universal things which may or may not apply to some of these other phenomenon, right? But I think you have to make that distinction. A lot of people asked, why is there a Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C.? It's a very good question. And why a part off the National Mall, part of the U.S. government? I mean, it'd be one thing if you built it in New York City, a city where a lot of survivors went after the war, a very large Jewish population. This is a Jewish event. This is for them. But the reason there's a Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C. is because it's because Germany was ostensibly an advanced, educated nation, right? It had a democratic constitution, it had a rule of law, it had free speech. In America, we think these are the things that will protect us from the very worst of human nature. And here you have what happened in the heart of Europe, civilized, advanced Europe, in this very educated, advanced nation, more Nobel Prize winners than any other country, and yet. And we stand there as a counterpoint to American democracy to remind people of the fragility of all societies, including democracies. So I do, and we're able to talk about that point by just looking deeper into the failures, what happened in German and European society that made that democracy so fragile and so susceptible to other events. I have to say, a story which has now become more relevant, not because of anything we did the same things, but current events around us. So people come looking at it and seeing in it what everyone brings to it their own narratives, what they're reading, but makes these connections. It was true when we opened, it is true today. And I want to just say one thing about Ukraine. To me, the Ukraine situation is very different for us than Rwanda. Rwanda was clearly a very clear case, genocide. There was no disagreement. Sometimes there are disagreements, is or something not a genocide. It's very clear. And some similarities to the Holocaust, some not. You could talk about those. The difference in Ukraine is not only the pretext that Putin made, but the history of that place. If you want to understand any place today, you have to understand its history. And that history is so rooted in the Holocaust. So it is a way to take a lot of interest in Russia and Ukraine and what this issue is all about, and talk about these roots that go back to, obviously the Soviet period and communism, but obviously World War II and Nazism.
I would like to add at this point the following observation. In the first part, at least, of this very interesting conversation, there were two terms that dominated the discourse: survivors and technology. And I want to mention two terms that were not mentioned and should be. The first one is victims, and the second is content. With survivors, of course, are very important and dear to our hearts. But let's not forget that we are talking about 6 million Jews that were massacred and never had the opportunity to stand in front of Steven Spielberg's camera or Yad Vashem's camera and give testimony, or to sit in front of a computer and type their memoirs. And content. You can manipulate content with high technology, and you can manipulate content with low technology. And with all due respect to the methods, that is what matters. And, you know, I will say it, though I must admit that I hesitated. You can write letters of congratulations to this event, marking the Jewishness of the victims, and you can also write a letter of congratulation to this event without even mentioning once the word Jewish. And for me, that is much more important, much more relevant than technology or museal considerations.
Dochodzą tu
Here we have more and more topics that emerge, because what Director Dayan called as content, we keep thinking of it. It's not an issue of technology or older, more traditional methods, but it is an issue of intention and honesty. This is what matters here. But in spite of all, I would like to ask you once again, because in my opinion, it is what matters here first and foremost. Piotr Cywiński said that we must include Holocaust, Shoah, extermination in our post-war identity. So as I understand, not only to root it in the sphere of facts and knowledge, although this is the foundation, but we need to make it a part of our thinking about the world. This is how I understand it. To make it an experience that has an active influence on the world that we would like to build, that plays an active part in it, and not only swallowing a pill of historical knowledge. And here, let me refer to what Sara Bloomfield and Piotr Cywiński will confirm at recent meetings of International Auschwitz Council. The survivors frequently referred to a very dramatic issue. Namely, they asked a question that, yes, in many countries, the Holocaust was included in teaching programs, in curricula, and a lot of money has been spent on it. But paradoxically, in some of these countries, there was an increase of anti-Semitic movements, an increase of racism and lack of tolerance. And this was the question which, with significant gravity, because it was asked by people who saw this tragedy, these atrocities. This was the question asked by Jewish survivors who lost their entire families, either here or in either places of Shoah. This was the question asked by historians, by those who came here as very young persons. And we know that for them it was the mission of their lives. And here, in my opinion, we need to ask two important questions: whether the diagnosis is right, and if so, where did we go wrong, and how to correct our mistake. And the second question, I would like to ask it once again, because it is so important. Do young people who come to our places, who visit Auschwitz-Birkenau, Yad Vashem, the place of Wannsee Conference, Washington, memorial site in France. So should we limit our message to telling stories about what happened here, or should we give them some more dots that they should connect? Or do we leave it to their discretion, to their own decisions? Director?
Okay, thank you for those questions, who are important, and they're huge questions, so I think we should just discuss for hours those questions. And I think we should not only talk about young people, we should talk also about old people, because it does not, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. And so I think we have to preserve the memory of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, and keep this as our main focus. But on the other side, when we look at our world today, the war in the Ukraine, when we look at other discussions taking place in the public discourse about, for the discussion about post-colonialism, about, I don't know, the rise of far-right parties, the debates about anti-Semitism, about the BDS movement, for example, I think this also demonstrates that the memory is constantly contested, questioned, and also criticized by many different camps and parts of the political spectrum. And I think that we, and maybe this is the answer to your second question, I think we cannot stand passively aside, but also need to position ourselves and explain why our work is still relevant for today. And this means that also we, to a certain kind of extent, we need to position ourselves. And we spoke about the war in the Ukraine already a bit. And I don't know, when I thought about the question you gave to us, or maybe let's start differently. This year, concentration camps concentration camp memorials in Germany did not invite Russian officials to liberation events, which is right. But I ask myself all the time, why did we invite them last year, and what will happen next year when the war in the Ukraine will hopefully or probably be over? Will we get back to normal suddenly? Or I don't know, what is going on tomorrow if, for example, an official delegation from Iran would like to visit our memorial sites? Do we just say yes, or I don't know, do we think about it twice? So, and we speak about challenges for our memorial sites, we think about the future, and for me it's important to also somehow think about ourselves and about our position and perspectives, and being a bit more self-critical. Because we have to critically ask ourselves as historians, as political scientists, as educators who work in those places, why did we not speak up earlier? And if we think about Putin or his narrative, so he rewrote history for many years. It's not something that happened 3 months ago. So he was establishing his historical narrative since a long time. And I don't know, I mean, I can only speak for myself, that I'm not sure if I was not aware of it or if it was far away. And yeah, maybe I didn't want to have a look at it. And I think that's also why it is so important to be here together today. We spoke about cooperation, about collaboration. I think we are in it together. And I think that's why it is important actually to think about strategies and how to deal with those events. And you were asking about the increase of anti-Semitism and if what does it mean for our work. So actually I think it's not paradoxically that there is an increase of anti-Semitism. I think there is no increase. I think we are just more aware of it. There's much more monitoring going on, and I think that there's more interest in the public discourse in the perspective of those who are affected by, for example, anti-Semitism. And this is maybe why we have the feeling that there is an increase. I think it just anti-Semitism never stopped. I think that learning about the Holocaust will not automatically prevent from becoming anti-Semitic or racist or xenophobic, and I think that we need to be aware of that. Auschwitz and the industrial mass murder became, in a way, a reference for anti-Semitism, which paradoxically caused that current forms of anti-Semitism are often overlooked or trivialized or even negated. And I think we need a way, or we need to find ways to correct this. Maybe even maybe it's better to reflect more about current forms of anti-Semitism in order to better understand its role and function during the Holocaust, and not the other way around.
Thank you. Professor, do you share this diagnosis from French point of view?
Oh, from France, there would be so many things to say. I'll just jump on 2 or 3 things, but about anti-Semitism and Auschwitz, in fact, and the Shoah, there's something quite interesting that happened in France. We had this presidential election, and among them we had this candidate from the far right, being Jewish, by the way, which shows there's some idiots among the Jews, obviously. And he claimed that the Vichy regime did not collaborate with the Third Reich, and so the Vichy regime was okay because it did not kill the Jews, which is not true, but it's very interesting because Deborah just hinted to something. Basically, you have people saying, if that's not the Holocaust, that's okay. The Vichy regime was the worst anti-Semitic regime in France, in all history of France, since the French kingdom. So you see people rehabilitating Vichy by saying, so it was okay. It wasn't. It wasn't a democracy. It was highly anti-Semitic, and so on. But now you have this political discourse saying it's not the Nazis, so it's okay. There's another point, and Sara Bloomfield spoke about it, but about genocide. There's something very important to understand. Usually when people speak, I'm not saying the people here in this room, speak about genocide, they think about the Shoah and Auschwitz, basically. They do not know what, from the law, from a legal point of view, what is a genocide. And again, you asked me about, from a French point of view, there was something very interesting going on in France since the war started, the Russian war in the Ukraine. Most of the politicians in France are saying there's no genocide going on in the Ukraine, which I don't think is true. I think there's a genocide going on according to the law, but they don't know the law, including our president. So it shows you that genocide by itself is a huge topic at the heart of our societies, and on the same time, we think a genocide through the Shoah, through Auschwitz, which is central for this, and we don't know what's going on. And we could speak about the Ukraine, which is very important, but we could also speak about what's going on in China for several years with the Uyghurs, and basically nobody cares in France, and so on. So the question is, Auschwitz is there, the museum is doing a tremendous work for decades. The awareness is increasing, yet racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism are still there. And I would say that in France, anti-Semitism is on the rise, both on the right and the left. And that's a very important point, because there's something that we should underline. Since the end of the Second World War, we think that anti-Semitism equal far right, equal Nazis. But at least in France, we don't know that the USSR kept on a very anti-Semitic policy from 1948 until the end of the USSR. In Poland, you know it better, because you had these policies from in 67, 68 especially. But in Western Europe, we think anti-Semitism is the far right. And we see, including in France, but we had the same thing in the United Kingdom, anti-Semitism coming from the left and denial from the left about the facts of those speeches being anti-Semitic. So all in all, if you combine genocide, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, I would say 70, 80 years after the Second World War, despite all the work done by historians, survivors, educators, it's like nothing was understood. Basically, nothing is understood from my point of view.
Bardzo ważną rzecz powiedział. Bardzo ważną rzecz powiedział
Professor Bruttmann said a very important thing, and I would like, I didn't know that you make it much more easier for me. We all remember this moving speech of Marian Turski on the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz camp. It resonated in the entire world. Many people refer to it in many countries of the world. And certainly these words resonated strongly because it was the person who, as a young Jew, was brought here from the ghetto in Łódź, who survived this inferno. His words were much more profound than as if they had been spoken by each and every one of us. But he said, I'm not going to present you my own memories. I'm going to talk about something different. I will tell you, and he referred to young people, I will tell you how it started. And this was the famous phrase that he quoted after by the president of Austria. Auschwitz did not drop from the heavens, from the skies, and he showed special stages of anti-Semitic gestures, words, which were tolerated as if nothing happened, nothing wrong happened yet. It's not pleasant, it is not nice, it would be better without it. But still, let's not tear our robes. He showed the entire path, the whole way, and it is one of the most important signs for us, and I keep thinking about it since that very moment. We should concentrate on showing the entire path that ends with the gas chambers and crematoria on industrial scale, Shoah, extermination, but to make it happen, to realize this, we need to make this history a part of our identity, the filter through which we look at the reality that surrounds us. And this is really important. It's like with Wannsee. I don't like that Shoah started with Wannsee conference. Everybody knows that it is not true. There are representatives of the camp in Chełmno, the first concentration camp that started to exist in December 1940. It was still before the conference, but it's not about the extermination camps. Perhaps this is the narrative that we need more and more, because the response from the world to the speech of Marian Turski was immense, because he managed to touch some important string to start changing the perspective. Piotr, you listened to his contribution. Do you think it is the right path? Marian started to speak to young people, and he spoke of himself as a young person, and it destroyed the historical barrier between him and his listeners and the audience. So all the time his speech is quoted. But if we ask ourselves a question, how we should talk about Shoah, about Holocaust. There are many levels of speaking. We behave differently while guiding people through the exhibitions when we talk about Auschwitz and nothing else. And this should not change. Certainly, there are some dots to be connected. And let the visitors connect their own dots. Let them leave the place with a belief that the dots must be connected, but it is their task to find them. But there are also some other tools for discourse. Sara Bloomfield gives the addresses so numerous that all other addresses put together would not outnumber her own addresses and statements. Your museum, Sara, presents a declaration, a statement every week, and we do it with our Twitter every day, commenting on today's reality. These are different platforms than the education that should educate about something specific, concrete, measurable, without going outside. But let's not be told that if in memorial sites we talk about measurable history, there are no other tools or layers or statements for the media in which we could call the contemporary phenomena by name. We have the right to do so and the obligation to do it. But also, there is a difference between our fundamental teaching and our evaluation of today's world. If in France, in Jewish secondary school, a couple of kids are murdered and the French television is coming to talk to me, I will not tell them, no, I'm dealing with Auschwitz only. I would be a monster if I did not connect these tragedies together. But these are different layers of discourse about today's world. But do you believe that these other layers should be included if we want people, and we do want them, to feel some moral responsibility for the contemporary world and for its future? Our work would be meaningless if we didn't feel it. So let's force ourselves to do it. Let's demand from ourselves much more. Sara?
Okay. A couple of thoughts about all of this. One is this question about we have failed or whatever. I'm not sure if that's the right question. In some ways, I think we only just got started, if you will. I mean, anti-Semitism has been around as long as there, have been Jews, right? It's not, in my mind, an eradicable disease. It's just that's just a fact of humanity. It has to do with human nature, with history, with culture, with things we all know about. We're not going to change human nature, but we can inspire human beings to think about it in different ways. I think that's probably a thread that all of us from our different perspectives that we can do, and use that word in your remarks. So, I mean, you could say, how would the world be if there hadn't been an Auschwitz State Museum, a Yad Vashem, and a Holocaust Museum, and Wannsee and all these other things working on these issues for all this time. But we're at the very, very beginning of something very long term. And by the way, I do think the Holocaust is an event of such magnitude that it is going to be relevant in 100 and 200 years. There will be people sitting here having another conversation. I don't think it's going to be just seen as a thing from the past, although it will be part of the past. I want to say something about our approach to, you started talking about what people learn when they come to Auschwitz. And one of the questions I have always is, how did we get to Auschwitz? What happened before? And I don't mean just before 1933, in the 30s in Germany. I mean even before that. And so one of the things we're trying to do at the museum, we're rethinking our entire permanent exhibition, and because we want people to think about what were the warning signs When could things have been different if different people had made decisions? And we're talking about people, not just true believers like Nazis, but some of the elites that brought them into power, ordinary people, people who led German institutions like the military, the churches, different parts of German society and European society. Yeah, we're trying to extend this way beyond Germany. And just so we have debates. How early should we start? Well, everybody agrees you can't start any later than 1918. Some people think 1914. Some people think the French Revolution. I'm in that camp, by the way, but I lost that argument. Anyway, because these things happen because they have deep roots in history and culture and people's identities of themselves. So I just want to end by saying something that I learned from probably the most famous filmmaker in America, Ken Burns, who does documentary films. I don't know if any of them get any play here in Europe. He's just done a film. He saw an exhibit we did on Americans in the Holocaust, looking at our own country, what we knew and how we responded. And he's now he's doing a film about that. But he's devoted his whole life to history and to try to make history relevant to new generations. And he says this, he says, don't ever tell people what to think. History's powerful enough. If you do good history storytelling, people will start to think. And he quotes an author who said, the best argument in the world won't change a single mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story. And unfortunately, the Holocaust is one of the most powerful stories in human history. So we have to treat it with respect and reverence and think about the modalities, and definitely the content has to drive everything. But that story, in my mind, is going to be relevant for the as long as they're human beings.
Thank you. I see Yad Vashem as the institution of the victims. There are many Holocaust institutions, Holocaust remembrance institutions, some of them on site, some of them not on site, like Auschwitz or Wannsee, others not on site, like USHMM and us. I think that what characterizes Yad Vashem is that we are the institution of the victims. And when I speak about institution of the victims, that means that I have to be extremely careful when I give opinions in the name of Yad Vashem, I mean now, on issues that, on different issues. Because for a moment, not for a single moment, I forget that among the victims of the Shoah were ultra-Orthodox Jews and atheist Jews, were anti-Zionist Bundists and ultra-Zionist revisionists. I like to say, to tell the story about the current and the previous chairpersons of our council. Our current chairperson is Rabbi Israel Meir Lau, a survivor of Buchenwald, former chief rabbi of Israel. His predecessor was Yosef Lapid, Tommy Lapid, the father of our new prime minister, a former minister of justice of the state of Israel, and a survivor from Hungary. Tommy Lapid concluded from the Holocaust that God does not exist, and Rabbi Lau concluded from the Holocaust that we must worship God with more fervor than we do. And I am in no position to say who is right and who is wrong, and I have to speak in the name of all the 6 million. I understood that so clearly on my first day on office. On my first day on office, the second thing that I did in Yad Vashem in August 23rd, 2021, was to tour the campus. The first was to meet 2 Holocaust survivors that still work in Yad Vashem. And in one of the walls of our art museum, which by itself is a mind-boggling thing, the fact that Jews that the Nazis tried to deprive them from any semblance of humanity continued to produce art, I saw a quote from Gela Zekstein. The original is in Polish. In our wall I saw it in Hebrew and in English. Gela Zekstein was a Jewish Polish painter in the Warsaw Ghetto. And she continued to produce works of art in the ghetto. At the beginning on canvas, with colors, and then on sheets of paper with improvised pencils. And she hid those works in the Ringelblum archive, in the Oneg Shabbat archive that was partly recovered after the war. But she put there one additional thing. She put there her last will and testament. And Gela Zekstein wrote in that last will, I am quoting freely, I know I am doomed. And indeed, she didn't survive. She didn't survive. Her husband didn't survive. Their 3-year-old daughter didn't survive. And I said there, I bequeath my works of art to the museum that the Jewish people will establish after the war. The moment I saw that quote, first I almost fainted, because I suddenly understood that Gela Zekstein is talking to me as chairman of Yad Vashem. She didn't call it Yad Vashem. She didn't probably imagine that it will be in Jerusalem, in an independent Jewish state. But I saw that quote as personally written to me as chairman of Yad Vashem. And to fulfill the will of the 6 million Gela Zeksteins is a daunting mission. That quote is today in my office. That's the first thing I see every morning. When I come to Yad Vashem, the last thing I see when I leave Yad Vashem, and for me is a very personal last will and testament. So I must be very careful in trying to speak in the name of those victims on matters that are not directly related to their remembrance. But on matters that are related to their remembrance, I must be unequivocal. And I want to say a word about what has been talked here about the lessons from the Holocaust in general and regarding anti-Semitism in particular. I am one of those that I believe like Director Cywiński, that we are not in the business of indoctrination. As I cannot decide who is right, Tommy Lapid, Zichrono Livracha, or Rabbi Lawi, Badel Chaim Arukim. I cannot speak in the name of the victims on contested issues. But therefore, what my mission is to tell the story. To tell the story in as many ways as possible, to meet as many audiences as possible, and technologies and Instagram stories are part of an educational process in that respect. Never forget, it's a process. A one-time hit, blockbuster is very nice, but education is a process, and conveying knowledge is a process. But I want to say one thing about anti-Semitism, modern anti-Semitism, and I will conclude with that. I was for 4 years Israel's Consul General to New York. When I arrived to New York in August 2016, I must be sincere, I thought that anti-Semitism will be low in my agenda. I even dared to believe that there are Jewish organizations, God forbid, that use anti-Semitism, that exaggerate anti-Semitism in order to raise funds. But then in 2 years, from October 18, less than 2 years, a year and a half, starting October 2018 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 15 Jews were murdered in anti-Semitic attacks in the United States of America. Not attacked, murdered, assassinated. So we have a serious problem. I want to say, I want to share with you a thought that I do share with all the dignitaries and leaders that come to Yad Vashem, including President Biden in 2 weeks from now. We are not in Europe of the 30s. Thank God we are far from it. There is anti-Semitism in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America, and in other places, in the Islamic world, but we are not in Europe of the 30s. But if there is something I think that we can agree as a lesson from the Shoah is that we have the experience that the generation of the 1930s didn't have. And we know it can happen. We know that if the anti-Semitism, when it shows first signs, is not confronted forcefully, vigorously, with determination until it is defeated, it can metastasize into monstrous dimensions. It can. We don't have the privilege of saying we couldn't imagine it can happen. That privilege was taken from us in Auschwitz. Therefore, that's the difference between saying never again and meaning it, if you confront anti-Semitism, or saying never again as a shallow cliche. And for me, that's... I don't foresee Yad Vashem in the coming years dealing with modern post-Holocaust anti-Semitism in the same way that we deal with the Shoah. But that lesson from the Shoah, I think that is imperative that they share it with the world.
Bardzo dziękuję, szanowni państwo. Teraz już za chwilę będę chciał
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. In a moment, I would like to give the floor to all those listening to us. I don't want to say the audience, because we are a single community of reflection, of joint or shared reflection over what we should do. But just for the end, a very short round for you, panelists. Could I ask you for very brief and precise answers? Let's start with you, Professor, and let's go one by one from my right further away. And the question is, what do you believe a person visiting our memorial sites, our museums, should, having left them, what do we want that person to know, what do we want them to think, and what do we want them to feel?
Sara said something very important, quoting Ken Burns, and she added a few things, and it's part of the answer. Survivors can speak about feelings because that happened to them. Us, and historians, teachers, museographers, we can only bring facts. You can't force someone to feel something, and feeling is something personal. I know people that wonder if that's right when they visited Auschwitz, they didn't cry, if something is wrong with them. Nothing is wrong with someone not crying. The question is, how do you understand what you see, what is explained to you, and what you do with it? That's my answer. And that we cannot have control over it. The only thing we can control is the narrative during the visit, for instance, the way the site is preserved, the memorial is constructed, or the lessons are explained to the audience. Beyond that, it's not in our power, at least mine, to control how someone is processing what he was explained. That's something else. And you can't know if someone who visited Auschwitz or any other site at the age of 14 will turn a criminal, a mass murderer, a racist. That's beyond what you can control. But you have to teach people, hoping that less and less will agree with murderous ideologies.
Okay, you need to rethink, Sara.
I have a very short answer. I think it would be wonderful if people would come away thinking it happened, it didn't have to happen, and there's something I can do.
Thank you.
I think that Holocaust remembrance today should be based on 4 pillars, and we should give 3 of them, and the 4th to give the tools to do the 4th. The first is mourning. We have a lot to mourn about. 6 million Jews that were murdered and others. Knowledge, to tell the story. I think it's probably the most important thing. By the way, the professors in Yad Vashem hate when I say to tell the story, because they say that story is not a word that is academically suitable, but I haven't found a better, they didn't come with a better word, so I keep saying tell the story. The third is a sense of feeling, trying to identify with the victims, with the survivors. You know, in the Passover Seder, we Jews say, in every generation has a person to see himself or herself as if he or she personally were left Egypt. I believe that today every person has to try to see himself or herself as if he or she personally were in Auschwitz. And the third is to learn lessons, but I am one of those that believe that every single lesson, even contradictory lessons, that are learned by decent persons using moral tools is legit. So we should give them the tools to do it, but the lessons to digest what they saw and felt, and learn the lessons by themselves.
Okay, I actually agree with what's just being said, also with you, Tal, especially. We cannot control what people feel or think. And I don't know, I think it's very difficult to give you a precise answer to your question. I think what is important, or would be important for me, is that people somehow have a better understanding why the past is still relevant for today. And Piotr, you have mentioned it, that we don't know much about the points of reference of our visitors. And I think I would like to have a better understanding what those points of reference, what are they?
Yeah, those visitors are, I think they knew something. It's very important. They adopt from an intellectual and emotional way some facts, but they have also a time to their personal reflection. It's something absolutely important. A visit of Auschwitz is, I don't know, 3.5 or 4 hours. It's a basic visit. The time for the reflection is something absolutely essential. Birkenau is a huge terrain, so we see very, very clear that people are walking and thinking by themselves. But for me, the most important is, yes, when they are going out, when the visit is over, they are going to a world that is too much indifferent, to a world that when we have too many bystanders. So my big dream is that those people who are in visiting Auschwitz, after this visit, get some moral anxiety about their everyday life choices.
Bardzo dziękuję i teraz powoli, płynnie będziemy przechodzili do Państwa głosów.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me now pass slowly to your voices, to voices from you, but could I please before that ask to speak those who are not here with us anymore, those members of the International Auschwitz Council who have passed through this hell on earth, who are already gone. I believe that their voice is absolutely important. We keep on talking about that voice of the survivors, but agreeing with Director Dayan, what they said was at the same time the voice of the victims, of those who did not survive. When during a session of the International Auschwitz Council we reached the last item on the agenda, any other business, we had discussed the technical and organizational matters, very concrete, very substantial. nearly always one of the survivors took the floor, and you could see that that was the moment they waited for throughout the session. They wanted to add something in their own name. And at least in a number of sessions, various survivors of the Shoah said the same thing. They said that they are afraid that with the passage of time, the world will turn indifferent to the power of the tale, that they're afraid that this is the cause of things, that new generations are coming, the emotional tie is broken. Some even say that it's the generation of great-grandsons that has a cold attitude to the events because they didn't hear things from their living grandpas. Nevertheless, there was that anxiety in the survivors. And just imagine, a number of times they said a very concrete and specific guidelines. It is very concrete, and at the same time, I would like every one of us, having left this room, to consider what more general and greater they wanted to share with us. Because what they said was, remember, always in that tale, in that story, to emphasize strongly the murdered children. 6 million of murdered Jews, 1.5 million children. More than 200,000 in Auschwitz. They said, unfortunately, that it won't be indifferent to a tale of murdered children. I'm leaving this without a word of comment. All I want is that their voices are heard, that kept returning in the sessions that I had the honor to participate in from 2006 to 2018. That was their voice, and that's something we must take into our hearts, but that's something greater. But as you said a moment ago, we impose no interpretation. Every one of us may consider what they wanted to tell us and why they believed that this is how this history is going to be alive, is going to be a part of our identity and make an impact on our lives. Please introduce yourselves briefly and share your questions and reflection. Oh, I see you have your mics. All right, I invite you to a discussion, and I suggest that we suggest the discussion with a special member of the Museum Council, a survivor, former inmate, Mr. Bogdan Bartnikowski. You know what a great joy it is always for us that we may have your presence with us, and how important it is always for us what you want to share with us.
When the war in Ukraine started, can you hear me? Yes. The first photographs on TV showed the Ukrainian children, and I saw a girl of 5 years, perhaps 6-year-old she was, and she was evicted from her home, and she carried her only souvenir from the home, a teddy bear. And what I saw before my very eyes was what I had seen 70 years before, when in a carriage I was taken from the uprising Warsaw, evicted from my own home to Birkenau. In front of me there was a girl, a Polish girl, who was also evicted from her own house, and she had a doll on her lap, the only treasure that she could taken from her times of freedom. she took it to here. There were many children in Auschwitz. There were thousands of them. Amongst them, in 1994, in August, I was very close to a large group of Jewish children who were here placed in Sector A and then Sector D, still in December 1944. They probably survived. There was a couple of thousands, a few thousands of them. There were Roma children, Soviet children among them, but in the last days of the camp, there were only Jewish children here who most probably survived, and they were liberated. And there was a group of a few hundred children taken from the Warsaw Uprising between 2 and 14 years old. I was a 12-year-old boy, one of them. I came from Ochota in Warsaw. Let me tell you just two things important for me, the former prisoner. These were important moments or actions that are carried out by the State Museum Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was the collection of documents about children kept in the camp. I know that the majority of Jewish children were not described. They were not put into the records because they were directed immediately to the gas chambers. Those whom I saw, it was just a fraction of this group. But from the first group, 20 years after the war, when I came to the camp to see whether what I had in my memory, whether this can be verified, even the topography, whether I remembered it well. So immedly we saw people looking after us, similar people to us, the girls and the boys that survived from war. So we were looked after by the museum staff, and on the basis of our stories, a number of works were created. Also, the memories of the children were included. And because of that, I believe that currently young people who visit on a mass scale the Auschwitz Museum, they can find and they can listen to what the guides say about the children kept in the camp, and they can learn about the memories on the basis of the publications that for many years have been prepared here by the Camp Publishing House. It is the second moment for me. The first one is creating the documentation about the martyrology and the death of children in the camp. And the second one is the work, the publishing work of the camp, because here there is a number of books published documenting Nazi crimes. The museum takes part in the national and international book fairs with their own stands, and I know from my own experience that the museum publications at the fairs are really very popular. Let me say one more thing. It's a personal issue. Several years ago, I was invited to another anniversary of the camp's liberation. I received an ID tag, and it said a guest. And then I had the opportunity to present my own contribution in the capacity of a former prisoner during the celebration. And I said that a guest is the Prime Minister and the ministers, and I'm not a guest here. I am a prisoner. I keep coming here frequently. I am invited often to present my memories from the period when I was an inmate. But this camp is still inside my mind. And I will never get rid of it. And I will always be present here because I believe that my visits, although very difficult and hard, are my lifetime obligation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bardzo dziękujemy. Szanowni Państwo,
Thank you.
proszę o
Ladies
kolejne
and
głosy.
gentlemen,
Pytania,
we need
refleksje,
next contributions,
komentarze.
questions, reflections or comments. My name is Hanna Wróblewska and I represent the Museum of the Warsaw Ghetto. Thank you very much for this moving discussion, and I would like to ask an open question. From your experience, from the point of view of your posts, do you see any role for artists and art? And I'm not talking about such obvious things as the art of those who did not survive, such as Gelas Eckstein, or the witnesses like Cywiński, all those who survived like Samuel Willenbeck. I mean the art that is being created now and will be created. We are talking about technologies which can become the tools. But can art be a tool, and what would be the role of an artist here? Thank you very much for this question. So, our panelists, Sara Bloomfield.
Yes, so it's a great question. It's a question we asked in our early years because we got offered lots of artwork. We, of course, collect art done in camps, in ghettos, in hiding. We consider that not art per se, but personal stories, documentation of the Holocaust and of a particular person's experience. But we do not use art, what we call post-period art. And the reason we don't is we have a very clear educational strategy. We want people to know what happened and to leave as critical thinkers and asking questions about why did this happen, that it didn't have to happen, what are my responsibilities in the world? So to do that, we focus very specifically on how the Holocaust happened, what made it possible, why did it happen? And post-period art just doesn't help us advance that goal.
Bardzo podobne mam podejście do...
I have a very similar approach as Sara Broomfield does. The art has its whole world in which it can express itself, so it does not have to do in the 200 hectares of Birkenau. There are many artists who would like to make their own installation or performances here. We do not take it to our collections. We don't agree for any installations. Concerts, well, after 16 years of my work, in 99.9%, it was absolutely clear for me that it was just the method of using this place for promoting the art of one more person, and I will not coin Auschwitz into the concert hall.
But we are reconsidering it. We are reconsidering it, and we are thinking very seriously on helping, encouraging artists and different media to create pieces of works of art that help the Holocaust remembrance. Again, the precondition has to be a very clear and undisputable distinction between fiction and reality and facts. We started very modestly. That's not really something to write home about, but with the Yad Vashem Prize that we established in the Doc Aviv Festival of documentary films in Tel Aviv. We awarded it to a film that I recommend very highly called 3 Minutes. But that's a beginning, a modest one, but as I said, we are considering it very seriously.
So maybe I can add something to that, because actually in Yad Vashem I was working with post-period art, with the postcards. I think you know them. I don't know if they are still produced, but actually it was very, I don't know, it was very helpful, but we didn't address like the core issue of the Holocaust with it. We took it as some kind of form of reflection to think about the way we commemorate the Holocaust. And in Wannsee, we started recently to work with post-period art and with artists, not in the main exhibition, but in the exhibition surrounding the building. And here we, for example, we address the issue or the topic of anti-Semitism today. We work, for example, we have been working with Michel Kiszka to express current forms of anti-Semitism and how they are connected to the Holocaust. Or, for example, we ask artists, German, Israeli, international artists, to produce something that deals with the question of emotions during a visit at a historical site. And I think it is very helpful to have some kind of connection between the past and the present.
Szanowni Państwo, kolejne pytania.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome some more questions. The ambassador, please. This is the microphone.
Thank you. Yaakov Livneh, I'm the ambassador of Israel to Poland. Short comment on the question. My comment is, I first visited Auschwitz about 20 years ago, privately with my wife. And I remember at the time, except of the shock that you come out of such a place, we asked ourselves the question whether it was actually clear that the vast majority of people who have been murdered here were Jews. Back then it was not. I think we have come a long way since, and this should be clearly reflected in what we say, in what we write, in what we publish on social media. So I hope very much that we will finish this process, which is essential. The second thing I wanted to say, visiting Auschwitz and places like Auschwitz are obviously extremely important because, as the director said, you come out of such a place probably in a way a different person than you went in. But not everybody have a chance to visit Auschwitz. I don't know what is the percentage of young people in Poland or certainly in Europe who have this opportunity. I suspect that not too many in terms of percentage. My question is, how do we bring more people to Auschwitz or places like this? How do we encourage the government or other institutions to bring more young people, and I stress young people, because I think this is the key. So how do we bring more young people here? And how do we teach them something about what has happened during the Holocaust and during the Second World War before they come here? Otherwise, it's a visit of a few hours that might not achieve everything we want to achieve. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much for this question.
Of course, it's very different from countries to countries in Europe. Some different tools were installed since few decades, 1-2 decades. maybe sometimes a little bit more, 3 decades, yes. In France, you have the Fondation pour la mémoire de la Shoah that is supporting some different educational, let's say, events or those visits here. There are some, of course, memorials in France that are their own relation with some regions in general. In Germany, it's different. It's more an issue according to the lands. In some other countries, there are foundations or associations or state institutions who are supporting those visits. And it's, for example, if the majority of the visits from Europe, I'm not counting Poland now, before the COVID was from Spain or from Great Britain, it is not because Spain or Great Britain has an enormous, let's say, terrific history about the Second World War. Geographically, they were, let's say, outside the German domination. But because politicians in those countries took decisions to create some very important financial tools to allow large groups of teenagers to come here and to visit. So it depends many times of decision how to help financially those teenagers to come. If not, there will all be some young people from some more wealthy, let's say, families. Not everybody. The problem was starting with the COVID, and this is something that we do not think about. But I was nearly 1 year ago, it was in September, I think, in Italy, in the north of Italy. And the north of Italy is very present in Auschwitz, in Dachau also, in many different camps. I've got a meeting with 400 young people, I don't know, 16, 17, 18 years old. And I asked them at the beginning, how many of you were already visited Auschwitz? It's important to know before I start to discuss with them. And in the north of Italy, in general, 40 or 50% would raise the hand. But because of the COVID, among those 400, only 10 raised the hand. We lost completely 3 years. That means one, let's say, secondary school in that time. If the majority who are coming here are coming as late teenagers before they go to the studies, those 3 years didn't have this experience. This is something that we have to think about it immediately, because very soon it will be too late to have them back.
Or other questions? Szanowni Państwo, kolejne pytania, komentarze.
Ladies and gentlemen, are there any further questions or comments?
Thank you. My name is Thomas Baum.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Director of the Kazerne d'Ossat, which is the waiting room for Auschwitz in Belgium. We have a memorial site. We have a museum. We distinguish them as well. And we have this archive and research center. And I want to introduce, I think, the real challenge of technology. And I'm curious for your reaction on, in my view, the real challenge of technology. The discussion thus far has still been informed in the way that it's still an instrument that we can use. So as educators, as guardians of the heritage, we will use technology in different ways to compensate or to open up opportunities. I'm afraid that we live in a technologized, the environment already has taken over. Yeah? So in the sense that the iPhone is a very clear example. And I'm afraid that in the future, the collective imaginary of what the Holocaust was might be determined by YouTube, Facebook, Google engines, and that we ourselves, we're now already in pursuit of making sure that this happens in a more or less decent or responsible way. And I'm curious what you think about it, because I think the public imaginary operates is often in different ways. I'll give a brief example of the centenary of the First World War commemoration in Belgium. There were lots of efforts by the government to arrange visits, to to do projects with the graveyards and so on. But one television series, fiction, reached, I think, quadruple people. A musical by a commercial company reached as much people as the government could reach in its official commemoration activities and all the educational projects that they financed. There seems to be a difficulty there in still weighing on the public moral imagination when it comes to working on this issue. And I'm curious what you have to say about it.
Very important question, please.
Yeah, so I would think what you're talking about is storytelling. I mean, in America, we have the same thing where a Schindler's List could reach more people in a second than we can. Or we had this incident, I don't know if it was reported in Europe, on a popular daytime TV show, like at 10 o'clock in the morning, where someone said, you know, the Nazis weren't racists. It was, you know, it's probably a lot of Americans would agree with that because they don't understand Nazism. That was so controversial that in 24 hours, that misstatement, because it was said by a famous person, helped us do more education in 24 hours about the true nature of Nazi ideology. So it's just the fact of the world we live in that popular culture, and of course the medium is technology, that we just have to realize that and do what we say in America is make them teachable moments. I want to say something, though, about technology, because we've done a lot of testing, and I just thought you should share some of the learnings we've had about using technology. We did a small exhibit showing American soldiers who had liberated camps and their stories, and we gave people the opportunity to take their cell phone out and listen to their testimony. Not more about them, but their actual testimony. And people weren't using it, including young people. So we asked them why. And they said, I don't come to a museum to use my phone. I come to a museum to get off of my phone and have a real, authentic experience. And we've had that research validated for us. I'll also say that I recently, because we're redoing our main exhibition, as I mentioned, and I traveled to many museums in Europe and in the United States, not Holocaust, but history museums, presidential libraries, and to look at how they do storytelling, we use the same word, and everywhere I saw technology, it was obsolete, the equipment was broken, kids were just coming in, pressing buttons and running to the next place to press buttons. The most effective technology I saw was what I'll call old technology, but enhanced. And by this, I mean taking photography and like backlighting it so that it feels real. It feels like you're standing in that forest where Jews were shot. It's like immersive, but without any fancy stuff. And the other thing now that we couldn't do at the beginning, if you know our museum, we blow up photographs very large so that the visitor is kind of in the history, looking eye level, just like your eyes, looking eye level with the people in the photographs. But when you blow it up, it gets very grainy, right? Now, through new digital technology, we can blow up the same old photographs, but lose that graininess. So to me, this is the kind of technology. Our visitor will never know it. It's just in how we recreate that experience. It's not a bunch of interactive things.
Yeah, on a different point of view, I've studied polls about French people, how they knew about the Holocaust. And among the less educated, with a lot of quotes, people were answering through commemorations on TV, not through museums, books, etc., commemorations. What we have to keep in mind is people will know it through museums, through books, through various ways and means, and whatever, but it's not going to cover everybody. And we can neglect various forms to bring knowledge to people. Saying, yeah, Twitter will solve everything. absurd, and forget everything else, and forget museums, memorials, teaching, and so on. And even things we don't think about. As an historian, I would never have thought that commemorations will bring knowledge. But for people that left school quite early, that's the way they knew about the Holocaust. So what do you do with that?
Piotrze, chcesz coś powiedzieć? Nie.
Peter, would you like
want
to say anything?
Comment on what Sara said about that entertainer, and that she said that the Shoah was not, the Holocaust was not about racism, and compare it to another statement, but a person that is definitely not an entertainer, that said in the Italian television that Hitler was of Jewish descent and the worst anti-Semites in the world were Jewish. The first one, the second one that I just mentioned was blatantly anti-Semitic. The first one, this that Sara mentioned, was deeply ignorant. And this is a differentiation that is very, very important to make between anti-Semitism and ignorance.
To ja jeszcze tytułem komentarza dodałbym jedną kwestię.
By the way of comments, may I add one more question, one more issue to consider further?
Rzeczywiście jest też tak, że
Is it really so that we try to raise with popular culture around many issues? We may surf that wave like a surfer, sometimes even silly things that make it to the public circulation help to spread education, but there is a whole wave of those horrible books that are allegedly based on facts on Auschwitz. Enough to enter a Polish bookshops. We've got tattoo makers from Auschwitz, hairdressers from Auschwitz, books that lie about the history of that place, that create a false imagination, a false semblance, and now taking into account their great popularity, they shape the human imagination, the human awareness. And when a celebrity or a politician, somebody famous, says something silly in a TV program or in an interview, that's an opportunity for us to break through with our message, to get the multiplier effect. But what? And that's a question to you, Piotr. What to do about the mass of that Auschwitz pulp that comes in ever greater amounts, that's ever harder to fight against, and that is to a greater and greater degree shaping the minds of people as to what happened here. First of all, it's make clear statements against it, debunk. This is fiction in the reality of Auschwitz. That's probably the most elegant and delicate way of referring to it. I could have used a more brutal phrase. Each of these books has it written in bold type, that the book was written after an insightful analysis, research, archives, consultations with historians, that yes, it is fiction, but it reflects the reality of Auschwitz. Well, with the several last books like that, I called Dr. Piotr Setkiewicz or other experts, archivists here, and asked whether this Australian author or somebody at least even once visited, called, asked for some documents, checked something. No, never. That's a rule. No, never. I've got nothing against authors writing fiction, just like Sherlock Holmes working in a London is a fiction, or Harry Potter, God knows where, but let them not write whether this is done based on research, thorough research. Just write that it's your fiction and you believe it's going to sell. The first rule is debunking, taking the masks off, proving that the mistakes are horrendous, that the person probably didn't even visit those places. They never read the books that they quote. Because later people say, hey, it says so in that book. People know that that one was a barber, that one was a photographer, he was a portraitist. These stories are quoted as facts, and that's what I've been trying to do in the last 3 or 4 years. If there's this new gem, we write point after point on several pages. We just tear the veil off that lie and debunk it as fiction. And the end. Okay, 3 more hands in the air I can see. They are the last ones for this debate. We'll be finishing Professor Berendt, and then we move up the rows. Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk, Grzegorz Berendt. I'm a historian who has that problem that he tries to ascertain the facts, at least the picture that can be obtained. Now, that problem that I have, focusing on the facts, makes me really bow down low before the works of literature and the works of visual arts that are capable of focusing and drawing attention to the events of the past and causing emotions. That's why I represent a different point of view than Sara or Director Cywiński. I believe that art, including the visual arts, are a tool at par with those technological solutions that you've discussed in extenso, to stimulate emotions, to stir the emotions, and to draw the attention, for example, of the youngest generation, to the most important things that places of remembrance speak of. That's my personal approach. Yes, you need to reach for art, that's what I'm convinced about, but the people who are responsible for the places of remembrance, from them, we must demand to be responsible for the content, what in that form is presented within those. Sara, would you like to comment?
I just want to say something about, not art, but about emotion, because I do agree. Emotion is really important. I think we would all agree. Somebody said it here. It has to be an intellectual and an emotional experience. That's the way you're going to make it because we want people to leave wanting to know more, wanting to ask more questions, and knowing this is important and having an unforgettable experience. In our museum, the 2 things that are so emotional are the victims' shoes and our Tower of Faces, which is one community, just pictures of their pre-war lives. You could say it's a work of art. I mean, some people I think would call it that because of the way it's done in the architecture. But I would say these are places where people come and they say it feels like we had the wind knocked out of us, that they go like this, and then they stop. And there's no pedagogy, there's no lesson there, there's no facts. People just absorb the meaning of it. And so I'm all for that emotion. I think just there are different ways to do it. And in ours, it's integrated throughout the exhibit. So it's part of the experience. So it's history, 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 emotion. And then we bring you back to more history and then more emotion. And it's like a pacing, an emotional and intellectual pacing of the journey.
Ja tylko dodam, że to samo wrażenie mam zawsze.
May I only add that I have the same feeling whenever I visit Yad Vashem. In Yad Vashem, once you have passed the exhibition, when I visited with someone who's there for the first time, we go to the place devoted to the memory of the children. You can also ask a question whether that is not a work of art, but it is so strongly integrated with history, with the place, that it is simply a part of that place. a very important one, a very emotional, and be assured it leaves no one indifferent. So the question is whether, on itself, without the exhibition, would it do it all? Perhaps not. And would the exhibition without that place be complete? Perhaps not, because that place would be missing. The place where knowledge touches you emotionally. The question is, I believe, sorry, it's a word of comment from my side. We must always ask the question to what degree that art is integrated into the place, into history. I'd also say to what degree it is necessary. Emotion is important, but emotion must come from what happened. Not really from different filters on the way. Sometimes you need to add filters of just exhibitory nature, but sometimes it's not necessary. It's not just a museum, it's a theater of murder, and that is more natural than a place of remembrance. First, it was a theater of a crime, of murder, and then it was a place of remembrance. And you perhaps mustn't use a place of murder for modern art, for some installations more or less successful. And it's not so that we would choose, okay, this is more successful, let's have it for 3 months, that would be here only for 2 weeks. Using a bit of the language of sociology of religion, entering the place of murder is a quasi-religious experience. We brush our shoulders with death here. It's got transcendental references because we meet death. It might have been Durkheim or Dünezil who said that every cult, not only religious, every, consists of what you say, what you do, and what you show. But this also means that a cult may also consist of what you don't do, don't show, and so on. And that's why in those specific places you simply need to think.
I think probably we are speaking about two different issues. One is art in the framework of a museum. That's one question. You can't relate, you can't describe the Children's Memorial as art. If you like, our exhibition starts actually with the video art work by Michal Rovner, one of the greatest video artists, contemporary video artists depicting Jewish life before the Shoah. But I wouldn't convert Yad Vashem into an exhibition, a place for art related to the Holocaust, post-Holocaust art. But when I said that we are considering to encourage a production of art is outside Yad Vashem, not in the framework of Yad Vashem. For instance, there is now a very nice initiative that we do encourage, a classical musical piece that is dedicated to Consul Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Kaunas that saved so many Jewish lives during the Holocaust. The piece is based on his life. It most probably will be, its debut will be in Kaunas in this coming November, and then probably, yes, we will probably perform it also in Yad Vashem. But it's not, an integral part of the Yad Vashem's exhibition. Is art at the service of remembrance in the big world, in the general, to the general public.
Poprosím następny głos.
Michael Groß, I'm the German Consul General in Krakow. I restrict myself to a short comment, remark due to the limited time, and it's a thank. On the 27th of January, we always commemorate the victims and the survivors, not as guests, if they are still with us, then we commemorate and honor them as survivors today. It's the 1st of July, and tomorrow the 2nd of July, so it's the day of the foundation of the museum Auschwitz-Birkenau 75 years ago. And I would like to express my gratitude to you, Director Cywiński, and to your whole team, Pani Director Szczepinska, Director Piotr, and also Director Andrzej Kapczorzyk, who just left the room. Oh, he's coming in. Okay, so...
we are talking about you.
Yeah, you were just mentioned. So our really big gratitude how you offer us the possibility to come to this authentic place of the Holocaust. And maybe Mrs. Hartmann said you don't like the this phrase term guardian, but you are a preserver. You preserve this place for us, that we can draw our lessons on a political level and on a very individual level about this never again. And I say this from a standpoint of a diplomat, that you always have a choice and it always matters how you personally decide. It's always about, also always about personal decisions. And for this, Director Cywiński, I know you are doing a hard struggle and you are doing a big work. On behalf of my government, our big gratitude.
I ostatni. A, jeszcze pan prezydent.
And the last person, okay, and then Mr. Please be precise and short. Roman Kwiatkowski, the Roma Association in Poland. My question is to the director of the Holocaust Museum, and I hope I'm going to get an answer, because this is an answer we've been waiting for many years. In 2010, the consultant of the Roma Association in Poland, while in Washington, paid attention to the fact that a part of the Holocaust Museum has a wrong date of the liquidation of our mistaken date of liquidation of the Roma camp. It says 30th, 31st August, but the sub-camp was liquidated by the murdering of all the prisoners on the night of 2nd, 3rd August. Our consultant paid attention to that error, to the custodian of that exhibition. However, several years later, another person working with us noticed that the exhibition still features this mistaken date. Dear Director, I'd like to ask whether this mistake is still there in the exhibition, and if yes, then why can't it be changed? That would call for professional approach, respect for the facts and respect for the history of the murdered Roma. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say that I'm not familiar with all the updates to the exhibition. Why don't we talk afterwards so I can go home and check on it? You give me your card and I can email you to answer. But we're constantly changing things. I don't know if that change has been made. But I want to say we appreciate everyone who comes to us and says something is wrong. We research everything because rigor is absolutely essential. So thank you very much for raising it.
Once again, I'll say we have written to you several times, but we've never received any answer.
Well, I'm sorry for that. I apologize.
Panie prezydencie.
Szanowni Państwo,
Mr.
ja może na koniec, ale właśnie
Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps closing, but this is going to be a voice of cities, or just different locations where these museums are sited, where,
70 lat temu. Już przeszło przecież.
well, in this case, it's been more than 70 years. Those events took place 77 years ago.
Też powiedzieć, że 75
I'd like to say that 75 years is also a part of my history, just because the relationships, I've been the mayor of Oświęcim for 11 years, those relationships between development, let's call it contemporary life of a special locality, and the tragic stories are sometimes convergent. And the skillful building of the relations between the living organism, a given city, a given location, of course. In large cities that may be different, like in Jerusalem, in Washington as well. Perhaps there are many other factors, or as in Lublin, if we look at Poland, but in case of towns like Dachau and Oświęcim, this impact of the place of remembrance is greater. For that reason, the finding of consensus is far greater. Director Cywiński has a plethora of experience, because I believe that what happened before 2011 was a bad example of how human ambitions, the way of perceiving things and sometimes just exploiting them, cause negative impacts for specific locations. May I use this opportunity to thank Director Cywiński and all the museum staff for the skill of looking for a consensus. Obviously, as a person who's open and trying to find that consensus, that agreement, I must say that we've been successful on many layers. Great thanks for that, and I hope that our further cooperation will bring positive fruit from the point of view of remembrance, education, but also an opportunity for the development of the city of Oświęcim. Thank you very much. Mr. Mayor, dear Janusz, consensus needs at least two parties, so I also thank for those thanks. Well, thank you for this consensus. And
samorządami wokół Auschwitz i wokół Birkenau.
I believe that we've managed to do it with the local authorities, not only around Auschwitz and Birkenau. Ladies and gentlemen, our debate is coming to a close. It is supposed to start something off. First, our joint reflection. That's why we are so glad that we are meeting here. That was the purpose of it. But this reflection is to lead later to joint action. We're deeply convinced that we can support one another, we can learn from one another, and the world also needs our common voice. One voice, one care for remembrance. We started from Kazimierz Smoleń's memory. There was that quote, and I mentioned it in the very beginning, how incredible it was that inmates, having no opportunity of any future, would go so far into the future, looking into it, looking ahead. But there are more such stories. These are the stories of the notes of the members of the Jewish Sonderkommando, people at the very bottom of hell, forced to serve crematoria and gas chambers. They knew they wouldn't leave this place alive. You would feel helpless in such circumstances. Yet they write, they hide it in the ground because they believe that in the future someone will find it, will find and won't destroy. but we'll take it to the heart. Take those words to the heart. See that act of courage and imagination. It's as if you put a letter into a bottle. That happens in adventure books. You put cork in it, throw it into the sea, and hope that it would reach the addressee. But many of those messages have reached us. And now this should be a particular inspiration for us. We need courage in thinking about the future. We need imagination when we think about the future. And we need, nevertheless, some hope that the future can be better, because rather than just sitting, we'll stand up and do something. And we would like to thank you very much for such a sense of community. A big round of applause to the members of the panel.
Piotrze, czy teraz jeszcze jakieś ogłoszenie?
Piotr, any household remarks?
Zapraszamy na lunch.
We invite everyone to lunch.